The rain was coming down in sheets that October evening when David looked me straight in the eye and said the words that would change everything. "Rachel, I can't do this anymore. Vanessa and I are taking the 8:15 to Seattle tonight. Don't wait up." He turned his back on me right there on Platform 3 of Union Station, leaving me standing with my suitcase and what I thought was a broken heart. What he didn't know was that I owned the railroad company that would bring me back to destroy his perfect little world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Union Station buzzed overhead as I watched my husband of 6 years walk away with Vanessa Moore, his coworker from Harrison Tech Solutions. They looked so confident, so sure of themselves as they boarded the northbound, trained to what they probably thought would be their new life together. David had his arm around her waist, the same way he used to hold me during our early days when I was just a struggling logistics coordinator trying to make ends meet in Portland. I stood there in my simple black coat, the one I'd bought from a discount store 3 years ago, clutching the handle of my worn leather suitcase. To anyone watching, I looked exactly like what David believed me to be, a woman whose biggest accomplishment was managing shipping schedules for small businesses around town, someone who could barely afford our modest apartment in Beaverton, someone who depended entirely on his income from his middle management position at the tech consulting firm. The irony was delicious, even through my shock. David had no idea that the woman he was abandoning owned Adams Logistics, one of the largest freight and transportation networks on the West Coast. He didn't know that the struggling coordinator he'd married was actually the CEO of a company that moved millions of dollars worth of goods every single day. He couldn't have imagined that his wife owned not just trucking fleets and warehouses, but also significant shares in 3 major railroad companies, including the one whose train he'd just boarded to escape his old life. As their train pulled away from the platform, disappearing into the rainy Portland night, I allowed myself a small smile. David thought he was leaving behind a burden, but he was actually walking away from a fortune he'd never even dreamed existed. More importantly, he was walking away from a woman who had spent 6 years carefully documenting every cruel comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment when he'd made me feel small and worthless. The rain intensified as I made my way to the parking garage, my heels clicking against the wet concrete. I'd been playing this role for so long that sometimes I almost forgot who I really was underneath it all. The modest car I drove, the simple clothes I wore, the small apartment we shared. Everything had been carefully orchestrated to maintain the illusion that David was the successful one in our relationship. I thought back to how we'd met at a coffee shop downtown, where I'd been sitting with a stack of invoices and shipping manifests, looking every bit the overworked logistics employee. David had been charming then, offering to buy my coffee and telling me about his important job at Harrison Tech. He'd seemed so impressive, talking about client presentations and quarterly reports, while I nodded along and played the part of the woman who was impressed by his corporate world. What David never bothered to ask about were the late-night phone calls I took in the other room, the business trips I claimed were training seminars, or the reason I never seemed stressed about money despite my supposedly modest income. He was too busy being the center of his own universe to notice that his wife might have depths he'd never explored. The deception had started as self-protection. I'd built Adams Logistics from nothing after my father's small trucking company was destroyed by corporate raiders when I was 25. I'd learned the hard way that showing weakness in business could be fatal, and that lesson had extended into my personal life. When I met David, I was already successful, but I'd been burned before by men who saw dollar signs instead of the woman behind them. So I'd created Rachel, the logistics coordinator, a woman who struggled to make her monthly targets and worried about keeping her job. I'd rented a small office space and created just enough paperwork to make the story believable. Meanwhile, the real Adams Logistics operated from a gleaming headquarters in downtown Portland, with Tom Harrison as my public-facing business partner and trusted friend. Tom was one of the few people who knew the complete truth about my double life. He'd been my college roommate's brother, a brilliant business mind who'd agreed to be the visible CEO while I pulled the strings from behind the scenes. It was a perfect arrangement that had protected both my business and my personal life for years. The irony wasn't lost on me that David worked for a company called Harrison Tech Solutions, sharing a name with my business partner, though he'd never made the connection. Tom had occasionally mentioned his mysterious silent partner to David at social gatherings, describing her as a reclusive investor who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. David had always been too self-absorbed to pay much attention to business talk that didn't center around his own achievements. As I drove through the rain-soaked streets of Portland, I thought about all the signs David had missed over the years, the way I never panicked about bills. The fact that I always seemed to have enough money for whatever we needed, explaining it away as careful budgeting or small bonuses from work. The phone calls from Tom that I always took privately, claiming they were from my demanding supervisor. But most of all, I thought about the way David had slowly revealed his true character over the years we'd been together. It had started small, little comments about my job not being as important as his, jokes about my lack of ambition, suggestions that I should be grateful he was willing to support someone in my position. As he'd grown more comfortable in our relationship, the mask had slipped further and further. The breaking point had come 6 months ago when David started working closely with Vanessa on a major client project. I'd watched him transform around her, becoming more animated, more confident, more cruel in his dismissiveness of me. Vanessa was everything I pretended not to be: elegant, successful, financially independent. She drove a luxury car and wore designer clothes and talked about her investment portfolio over dinner. What neither of them knew was that I'd been quietly investigating Vanessa's background for months. Her success wasn't quite what it appeared to be. Her luxury lifestyle was funded by maxed-out credit cards and loans she could barely afford. Her investment portfolio was largely fictional, built on borrowed money and risky schemes that were about to collapse. She was exactly the kind of person who would be attracted to David's middle management salary and see him as a ticket to financial stability. The plan that was now forming in my mind had been months in the making. I'd started preparing for this moment the first time I'd caught David texting Vanessa late at night, claiming it was about work while clearly discussing their growing attraction to each other. I'd documented every lie, every secret meeting, every moment when he'd chosen her over his marriage. But tonight's dramatic departure from Union Station had given me something I hadn't expected: the perfect stage for his eventual downfall. David thought he was making a grand romantic gesture, sweeping Vanessa away on a train to start their new life together. What he didn't realize was that he'd just provided me with the most poetic setting imaginable for his comeuppance. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Saw the news about the Harrison project. You okay?" He was referring to the major contract that David's company had been competing for, the one that would determine whether Harrison Tech Solutions thrived or struggled in the coming year. What David didn't know was that the client they'd been courting was actually one of Adams Logistics' subsidiary companies, and the decision about which consulting firm to hire was ultimately mine to make. I typed back quickly. "Better than okay. Time to implement Phase 1. Tom would understand. We'd discussed this contingency plan months ago, back when it first became clear that David's affair was more than just emotional. Phase 1 involved a carefully orchestrated series of business decisions that would put pressure on Harrison Tech Solutions, making David's job increasingly difficult while making Vanessa question whether he was really the successful catch she thought she'd landed. As I pulled into the parking garage of my modest apartment building, I allowed myself to think about the endgame. In 3 days, there would be a major transportation industry conference in Seattle. David had no idea that his wife was the keynote speaker, or that Vanessa would be watching from the audience as Rachel Adams, CEO of Adams Logistics, took the stage to announce several major business initiatives that would reshape the regional economy. But first, there was work to do. I had calls to make, meetings to arrange, and a very special train to charter for my return to Seattle. After all, if David wanted to make grand romantic gestures involving trains, I could play that game too. The difference was that when I made my entrance, I'd be arriving in style on transportation that I actually owned. I climbed the stairs to our apartment, noting how small and shabby it looked compared to the penthouse I actually owned across town. This place had served its purpose for 6 years, providing the perfect backdrop for my performance as the struggling logistics coordinator. But after tonight, I'd never have to pretend to be less than I was ever again. The apartment felt different, now that David was gone. His absence wasn't painful, it was liberating. I walked through the rooms we'd shared, seeing them clearly for the first time in years. The cheap furniture I'd insisted we buy to stay within my supposed budget. The single bedroom with its simple decor. The kitchen where I'd cooked modest meals while secretly owning restaurants throughout the city. I went to the bedroom and began packing, but not the way David might have expected. From behind a false panel in the closet, I retrieved the designer clothes I'd been hiding for years. The real Rachel Adams wardrobe, featuring pieces from fashion houses that cost more than David made in a month. Tomorrow, I would start dressing, like the CEO I actually was. My phone rang, and I wasn't surprised to see it was Lisa Chen, my assistant at Adams Logistics. Lisa was another member of my inner circle, one of the few people who knew about my double life and had been helping me maintain it for years. "Rachel, I just heard from Tom. Are you really going through with this?" Her voice was concerned but also excited. "Oh, Lisa," I said, sliding a silk blouse into my suitcase. "I'm not just going through with it. I'm going to make it spectacular." We talked for another 20 minutes, finalizing the details that would turn my husband's betrayal into the most expensive mistake of his life. By the time I hung up, the groundwork was laid for a revelation that would destroy everything David thought he knew about success, power, and the woman he'd just abandoned at a train station. The rain had stopped by the time I finished packing. I stood at the window, looking out at the city where I'd built an empire while pretending to be barely scraping by. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. David thought he'd escaped his boring marriage and found himself a sophisticated woman who could match his ambitions. He had no idea that his boring wife was about to become his worst nightmare, and that the sophisticated woman he'd chosen was nothing more than an illusion built on debt and desperation. The train that had carried him away from me tonight was just the beginning of his journey. The bullet train that would bring me back to him would be the end of everything he thought he'd gained. I smiled as I turned away from the window. After 6 years of playing small, it was finally time to show David Adams exactly who he'd married, and more importantly, exactly what he'd just thrown away. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, a sharp contrast to the stormy night that had changed everything. I woke up in my real bedroom for the first time in 6 years, the one in the penthouse overlooking the Willamette River that David never knew existed. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city where I'd built my empire in secret. And for the first time in years, I didn't have to rush to maintain the illusion of being someone smaller than I actually was. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lisa arrived at 7 sharp with coffee from the boutique roastery I owned, but had never been able to visit with David. She spread a series of folders across my granite kitchen island, each one containing a piece of the puzzle that would systematically dismantle the life my husband thought he was building with Vanessa. "The Harrison Tech contract proposal came in overnight," Lisa said, sliding the first folder toward me. "Tom rejected it this morning, citing concerns about the company's stability and leadership structure." I sipped my coffee, savoring both the rich flavor and the irony. David had spent the last 3 months working 18-hour days on that proposal, convinced it would be his ticket to a promotion and the financial security that would impress Vanessa. He'd bragged to me about the potential commission, describing in detail how the money would finally allow him to leave his struggling wife an upgrade to someone more worthy of his success. What was his reaction? I asked, though I could already imagine David's panic when he learned that the contract he'd counted on had slipped through his fingers. Tom recorded the call. David sounded confused, then angry. He kept insisting there must be some mistake, that the proposal met all the client requirements perfectly. Lisa pulled out her tablet and played the audio file. David's voice filled my kitchen, tinged with the desperation of a man watching his carefully laid plans crumble. This doesn't make sense. We had inside information that this was exactly what they wanted. Someone must have sabotaged us. If only he knew how right he was about the inside information and how wrong he was about who had provided it. For months, I'd been feeding Tom details about Harrison Tech's capabilities and weaknesses, information I'd gathered from David's own late-night work sessions and phone calls. Every strategy they'd developed, every competitive advantage they thought they had been shared with me in David's arrogant confidence that his wife was too simple to understand the complexities of corporate maneuvering. The second folder contained surveillance photos from Seattle, taken by the private investigator I'd hired to document David and Vanessa's romantic getaway. The images told a story that was both predictable and pathetic. There was David trying to impress Vanessa with an expensive dinner at a restaurant he couldn't really afford. There was Vanessa checking her phone obsessively, probably monitoring her credit card balances and realizing that her new boyfriend's financial situation wasn't quite what she'd hoped. The hotel they're staying at is interesting, Lisa noted, pointing to one of the photos. The Fairmont Olympic. David paid for a suite with his personal credit card, but Vanessa has been making additional charges to the room that she's not telling him about. Spa treatments, room service, shopping in the hotel boutiques. She's already run up about $3,000 in extras. I studied the photos more carefully. David looked tired and stressed, the kind of expression he used to wear when he was worried about money, but trying to hide it from me. Vanessa looked radiant and relaxed, clearly enjoying her vacation from reality. Neither of them seemed to realize that their financial honeymoon was about to come to an abrupt end. The third folder was the most interesting. It contained a complete financial profile of Vanessa Moore, compiled by the forensic accountant's eye, kept on retainer for particularly complex business investigations. The picture it painted was even worse than I'd suspected. She's leveraged to the absolute limit, I observed, scanning the credit reports and bank statements. 7 maxed-out credit cards, 3 personal loans, and a mortgage that's underwater, by about $40,000. It gets worse, Lisa said, flipping to the next page. She's been using cash advances from one credit card to make minimum payments on the others. She's about 6 weeks away from complete financial collapse, and that's assuming nothing unexpected happens to accelerate the timeline. I smiled, thinking about the unexpected things that were definitely going to happen to accelerate Vanessa's financial timeline. Tom had already started implementing the first phase of our plan, which involved calling in some strategic favors from companies in our network. Has her employer been contacted yet? I asked. This morning. Meridian Marketing. Just learned that 3 of their biggest clients are terminating their contracts, effective immediately. All 3 cited budget constraints, but the real reason is that Tom made some calls. Vanessa's division is going to be downsized significantly, and her position is first on the chopping block. Meridian Marketing was a mid-tier advertising agency that specialized in campaigns for shipping and logistics companies. What they didn't know was that most of their major clients were either owned by Adams Logistics or had exclusive contracts with us that gave me significant influence over their vendor relationships. A few strategic phone calls from Tom, framed as cost-cutting measures in a challenging economy, had been enough to put Vanessa's job in serious jeopardy. The beautiful irony was that Vanessa would probably assume the job loss was connected to the general economic uncertainty that had been affecting the marketing industry. She'd never suspect that her new boyfriend's abandoned wife had orchestrated her professional downfall from behind the scenes. What about David's situation at Harrison Tech? I asked, moving to the fourth folder. Paul Rodriguez called an emergency. Meeting for this afternoon. Word is that they're facing a cash flow crisis now that the Adams Logistics contract fell through. They were counting on that revenue to fund their expansion plans, and without it, they're going to have to make some difficult decisions about staffing. Paul Rodriguez was David's boss, a decent man who'd always treated me kindly at company social events, though he'd clearly bought into David's narrative about his wife's limited career prospects. I actually felt a bit sorry for Paul, who was about to learn that his employee's personal life had inadvertently destroyed his company's most important business opportunity. But sympathy wouldn't stop me from implementing the next phase of the plan. Lisa pulled out her phone and showed me a text message that had been sent to David's work number 30 minutes ago. Urgent family emergency. Return to Portland immediately. Train tickets have been arranged. Platform 7, 2:30 p.m. departure. The message appeared to come from David's sister, but it had actually been sent by one of my tech specialists using a spoofed number. David's sister lived in Phoenix and had no idea that her brother was in Seattle with his mistress. But David would assume she was in Portland dealing with some crisis involving their elderly mother, and his guilt about abandoning his family would compel him to return immediately. "Will he actually come back?" Lisa asked. "Oh, he'll come back," I assured her. "David may be selfish and cruel, but he's not completely heartless. He'll convince himself that he's being noble by responding to a family emergency, and Vanessa will have to understand that duty calls." The fifth folder contained the most satisfying element of the day's preparations. Inside were photographs of a sleek silver bullet train that had been custom designed for private charter. The train belonged to Pacific Rail Luxury, a subsidiary company that I'd acquired specifically for occasions when I needed to make a dramatic entrance. "She's beautiful," I said, admiring the images of the train's pristine exterior and luxurious interior. "What's the estimated arrival time?" "The route has been cleared for 4:15 p.m. She'll pull into Union Station on Platform 3, exactly where David left you last night. The timing should put you there about 30 minutes after David arrives from Seattle." I closed the folder and walked to the window, looking down at the city that was about to witness the most expensive divorce revelation in Portland's history. Somewhere out there, David was probably arguing with Vanessa about whether he really needed to rush back to deal with a family emergency that didn't actually exist. Somewhere else, Vanessa was probably checking her bank balance and realizing that her credit cards were closer to their limits than she'd thought. Neither of them had any idea that their perfect romantic escape was about to become the prologue to their complete financial and professional destruction. "There's one more thing," Lisa said, pulling out a final document. "Tom wants to know if you're sure about the nuclear option." The nuclear option was our term for the most devastating element of the plan, the one that would ensure David and Vanessa never recovered from their betrayal. It involved revealing not just my true identity, but also the extent to which I'd been protecting David from the consequences of his own mediocrity for years. "I'm sure," I said without hesitation. "David spent 6 years making me feel worthless and small. He convinced me that I should be grateful for his attention, that no one else would want someone as unremarkable as me. He threw away our marriage for a woman who's nothing more than an illusion built on debt and desperation." I turned back to Lisa, feeling the full weight of my decisions settling around me like armor. "He wants to play games with trains and grand romantic gestures? Then we'll give him a train he'll never forget." The rest of the morning was spent in meetings with my senior staff, finalizing the details that would make this afternoon's revelation as devastating as possible. Tom arrived at 11 with a box of documents that would expose every lie David had told about his professional accomplishments and every favor I'd quietly arranged to keep his career afloat. "These are the contracts he thinks he negotiated himself," Tom explained, spreading the papers across my conference table. 12 major deals over the past 4 years, all of which happened because you put in a good word with the right people." I examined the documents. remembering each conversation I'd had with clients and competitors, carefully dropping hints about Harrison Tech's capabilities without ever revealing my connection to David. I'd built his reputation one strategic recommendation at a time, creating the illusion that he was a rising star in the Portland business community. And these are the companies that agreed to extend payment terms when Harrison Tech was struggling with cash flow, Tom continued, indicating another stack of papers. Every single extension was granted as a personal favor to you. David had no idea that his wife had been the invisible safety net that prevented his company from failing multiple times over the years. He'd attributed their good fortune to his own negotiating skills and the company's strong reputation, never questioning why competitors were so willing to work with them or why clients seemed unusually patient with late payments. The irony was delicious. David had spent years mocking my supposed lack of business acumen while benefiting from my actual business connections. He'd described me to Vanessa as someone who couldn't understand the complexities of corporate strategy, never realizing that I was the one who'd been pulling the strings behind most of his professional successes. At 1 o'clock, I retreated to my private office to prepare for the afternoon's performance. I selected a charcoal gray Armani suit that had been tailored specifically for important business presentations, paired with Italian leather shoes that cost more than David earned in a month. The transformation from struggling logistics coordinator to powerful CEO was more than just cosmetic. It was a complete reimagining of how I moved through the world. Lisa knocked on my door at 1:30. David just boarded the train in Seattle. He'll arrive at Union Station at 3:45. Vanessa decided to stay in Seattle to handle some urgent business matters. I laughed at the euphemism. Vanessa's urgent business was probably a desperate attempt to secure additional credit or find a way to extend her hotel stay without admitting to David that she couldn't afford her share of their romantic getaway. And our train? On schedule. Marcus Thompson is already aboard with the documents you'll need. The media team is in position, and Tom will be waiting on the platform with the full presentation. Marcus Thompson was my personal attorney, a sharp legal mind who'd been helping me prepare for this moment for months. He'd drafted the divorce papers that would ensure David received nothing from our marriage except the debt he'd accumulated trying to impress his mistress. More importantly, he'd prepared the cease and desist orders that would prevent David from claiming credit for any of the business relationships I'd built on his behalf. At 2 o'clock, I left my penthouse for the last time as David's wife. Next time I returned, I'd be Rachel Adams, divorced CEO, free to live openly as the woman I'd always been beneath the performance of the past 6 years. The ride to the private rail facility was peaceful, giving me time to reflect on how dramatically my life was about to change. For so long, I'd been living in two worlds, maintaining the exhausting fiction of being less successful than I actually was. After today, there would be only one world, and I would stand at the center of it as the powerful woman I'd worked so hard to become. The bullet train was even more impressive in person than it had been in photographs. The sleek silver exterior gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and the custom interior featured leather seating, mahogany paneling, and every luxury amenity imaginable. This wasn't just transportation, it was a statement of power and success that would be impossible for anyone to misinterpret. Marcus was waiting in the main cabin with a briefcase full of documents and a smile that suggested he was looking forward to the afternoon's revelations almost as much as I was. "Everything is ready," he assured me as the train began to move. "Tom has the PowerPoint presentation loaded on his tablet. The financial documents are organized by category, and I have copies of David's credit report showing the debt he's accumulated over the past 6 months." As we glided through the Oregon countryside toward Portland, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't experienced in years. The scared, heartbroken woman who'd been abandoned at Union Station the night before was gone forever. In her place was someone who'd learned the true value of patience, planning, and the element of surprise. The train's intercom crackled to life as we approached the city limits. "Mrs. Adams, we'll be arriving at Union Station in approximately 10 minutes. Platform 3 is clear and ready for your arrival." I looked out the window at the familiar skyline of Portland, the city where I'd built my empire in secret and where I was about to reveal the truth that would destroy the man who'd thrown me away. David thought he'd escaped to start a new life with a sophisticated woman who matched his ambitions. He was about to learn that the most sophisticated woman he'd ever known had been sleeping beside him for 6 years, and that his ambitions were nothing compared to the empire she'd built while he wasn't paying attention. The silver bullet train glided into Union Station with the quiet precision of advanced engineering, drawing stares from everyone on the platform. Through the tinted windows, I could see David standing exactly where he'd left me the night before, looking confused and slightly panicked as he checked his phone repeatedly. He was clearly wondering why his sister hadn't shown up to meet him, unaware that the family emergency that had summoned him home was nothing more than an elaborate fiction, designed to get him exactly where I needed him to be. The train came to a complete stop with barely a whisper, and I remained seated for a moment, watching David through the window. He looked older somehow, worn down by whatever had transpired during his abbreviated romantic getaway with Vanessa. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested their perfect escape hadn't gone quite as planned. Marcus adjusted his tie and gathered his briefcase. "Are you ready for this, Rachel?" I smoothed my Armani jacket and checked my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me bore no resemblance to the defeated wife who'd been abandoned. On this same platform, less than 24 hours ago, my hair was styled in the sleek bob I'd been hiding under cheap haircuts for years. My makeup was professionally applied, highlighting features that David had never bothered to really see. My jewelry was understated but clearly expensive, the kind of pieces that whispered rather than shouted about wealth and taste. "I've been ready for this for 6 years, I replied, standing as the train doors opened with a soft hiss. The first person to step onto the platform was Tom, carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of confident smile that came from knowing you held all the winning cards. He was followed by Lisa, impeccably dressed and carrying a leather portfolio that contained enough evidence to destroy both David's career and his relationship with Vanessa. Marcus emerged next, his presence immediately commanding attention from the handful of other passengers and railway employees who were witnessing this unusual arrival, and then I stepped off the train. The effect was immediate and electric. David's mouth fell open, his phone slipping from his fingers and clattering to the concrete platform. Several other people turned to stare, clearly recognizing that something significant was happening but not quite understanding what they were witnessing. A few even pulled out their own phones to capture what they instinctively knew was a moment worth recording. I took my time walking toward David, my heels clicking against the platform with the rhythm of inevitability. Each step was calculated, deliberate, designed to give him time to process what he was seeing while his world crumbled around him. "Hello, David," I said when I was close enough for him to hear my voice clearly. "I trust your trip to Seattle was everything you hoped it would be." He stared at me as if I were a ghost, his eyes darting between my face and the luxury train behind me, trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the wife he thought he knew. "Rachel? What? How did you? Where did that train come from?" "Oh, this old thing?" I gestured casually toward the bullet train. "It's mine, just like the railroad company that operates it. Just like the logistics empire that's been keeping your little consulting firm afloat for the past 4 years." The color drained from David's face as the implications of my words began to sink in. Behind me, Tom was setting up a portable presentation screen, while Lisa arranged several folders on a nearby bench. Marcus stood slightly apart, observing everything with the detached professionalism of someone who'd witnessed many such revelations in his legal career. "I don't understand," David stammered. "You work for a small shipping company. You barely make enough to cover your share of the rent." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone and showing him the screen, "I am the small shipping company, and about 37 other not-so-small shipping companies. Adams Logistics grossed $460 million last year, David. That's considerably more than your share of the rent. Tom looked up from his tablet. The presentation is ready whenever you are, Rachel. I nodded and turned back to David, who was swaying slightly as if the platform had started moving beneath his feet. Tom, I'd like you to meet my husband. David, this is Tom Harrison, my business partner and the public face of our operations. You've actually met him several times at corporate events, though you never bothered to pay much attention to his stories about his mysterious silent partner. Recognition dawned slowly in David's eyes as he remembered the conversations he'd dismissed as boring business talk. Tom extended his hand with a polite smile, but David was too stunned to respond to the gesture. Shall we begin? Tom asked, activating his tablet. The portable screen lit up with the Adams Logistics logo, followed by a series of financial charts. That told the story of a business empire built from nothing into one of the most successful transportation companies on the West Coast. For the past 6 years, I began, my voice carrying the authority I'd been forced to hide for so long. You've been married to the founder and CEO of Adams Logistics. Every success you thought you'd earned through your own merit was actually the result of my business connections and strategic interventions. The first slide showed a timeline of David's career milestones, each one marked with a corresponding notation about the behind-the-scenes assistance I'd provided. The Patterson Industries contract that had earned him his first promotion had come through my recommendation to a client who owed me favors. The Morrison Group deal that had made him Employee of the Month had been facilitated by my agreeing to offer them preferential shipping rates. David's legs seemed to give out, and he sank onto the bench next to Lisa's folders. This can't be real. You're making this up. Lisa opened the first folder and handed him a stack of documents. These are the contracts, David. Your signature is on all of them, but if you look at the negotiation notes, you'll see that every major concession and favorable term was granted as a courtesy to Adams Logistics. I watched David's hands shake as he flipped through the papers, seeing his professional life laid bare in a way he'd never imagined. Every deal he'd been proud of, every client relationship he'd thought he'd built through charm and skill, every moment when he'd felt successful and important, it all traced back to his wife's invisible influence. The Hendricks account, Tom continued, advancing to the next slide, renewed their contract with Harrison Tech 3 times despite being dissatisfied with your team's performance. They did it because Rachel personally called their CEO and asked them to give you another chance. The Yamamoto Corporation extended your payment terms by 90 days when Harrison Tech was having cash flow problems 2 years ago, Lisa added, pulling out another document. That extension saved your company from bankruptcy, and it happened because Rachel has a long-standing business relationship with their North American operations. David looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and growing horror. Why? Why would you do all of this and never tell me? I sat down beside him, close enough that only he could hear my next words. Because I wanted to see if you could love me for who you thought I was. I wanted to know if you could value me as a person, not as a business opportunity. The truth was more complicated than that, of course. I'd started the deception as protection, but I'd maintained it as a test. Every time David had mocked my supposed lack of ambition, every time he'd made me feel small and worthless, every time he'd suggested that I should be grateful for his attention, he'd been failing a test he didn't even know he was taking. And the results of that test, I continued, standing up and addressing him more formally, were unambiguous. You failed spectacularly. Tom advanced to the next slide, which showed a compilation of text messages between David and Vanessa over the past 6 months. Lisa had obtained them through completely legal means, using the digital forensic services that Adams Logistics employed for corporate security purposes. Let's talk about Vanessa, I said, my voice taking on the cold professionalism I used in the most difficult business negotiations. The sophisticated woman you chose over your supposedly unsuccessful wife. The screen filled with Vanessa's financial profile, displaying a mountain of debt that would have impressed even the most reckless spender. Credit card balances that totaled more than David made in a year. Personal loans with interest rates that suggested desperation. A mortgage that was underwater by an amount that would have made her ineligible for any legitimate refinancing. Your girlfriend, I announced, is approximately 6 weeks away from personal bankruptcy. The luxury lifestyle that impressed you, so much was funded entirely by borrowed money that she has no realistic way of repaying. David stared at the numbers on the screen, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, betrayal, and dawning comprehension. She told me she was financially independent. She said she had investments. She does have investments, Marcus interjected, speaking for the first time since leaving the train. Unfortunately, they're all leveraged positions that are currently showing significant losses. Her portfolio is worth about $37,000 less than she owes on the margin loans she used to purchase the securities. Lisa pulled out her phone and showed David a series of photos. These were taken this morning at the Fairmont Olympic in Seattle. Your romantic getaway, which Vanessa assured you she could afford to split, has been charged entirely to her credit. Cards, the suite, the meals, the spa treatments, the shopping, everything. The photos showed Vanessa making increasingly frantic phone calls, presumably to credit card companies and banks. Other images captured her at the hotel's business center, frantically typing what appeared to be loan applications and financial appeals. She's currently trying to secure additional credit to cover the expenses from your trip, Tom explained. So far, she's been denied by 4 different lenders. David's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The name on the screen read, Vanessa, mobile, and his hand hesitated over the device as if he was afraid to answer it. Go ahead, I encouraged him. I'm curious to hear how she plans to explain her current situation. He answered the call on speaker, his voice barely above a whisper. Vanessa? David, thank God. Her voice was tight with panic, all pretense of sophistication stripped away by desperation. There's been some kind of mistake with my credit cards. They're all being declined, and the hotel is threatening to hold my luggage until I settle the bill. How much do you need? David asked, though he was staring at the financial documents that made it clear he couldn't afford to help her even. If he wanted to. It's just temporary. Maybe $15,000 to cover everything. I can pay you back as soon as I sort out this mess with the banks. $15,000 was more than David had in his checking and savings accounts combined. Even if he maxed out his own credit cards, he couldn't cover Vanessa's debts, and the expression on his face suggested he was finally beginning to understand the scope of the deception that had been practiced on him. I need to call you back, he said quietly, ending the call. The platform fell silent except for the distant sounds of trains and announcements echoing through the station. David sat with his head in his hands, surrounded by the evidence of 2 simultaneous betrayals, his own betrayal of his marriage and Vanessa's betrayal of his trust. There's more, I said gently, not taking any pleasure in his obvious distress, but determined to ensure he understood the complete consequences of his choices. Tom advanced to the final slide, which showed the Harrison Tech logo with a large red contract terminated stamp across it. As of this morning, Adams Logistics has severed all business relationships with your company. We've also contacted our network partners and recommended they do the same. The Patterson Industries renewal you were counting on has been canceled, Lisa added. The Morrison Group is reviewing their contract with an eye toward early termination. Hendricks Industries has already signed with a competing firm. Marcus stepped forward with his briefcase. David, you need to understand that the success you've enjoyed over the past 6 years was entirely dependent on your wife's goodwill and business connections. Now that your marriage is over, those connections are over as well. Additionally, I continued, any attempts to claim credit for the relationships and deals that were actually facilitated by Adams Logistics will be met with immediate legal action. The non-disclosure agreements you unknowingly benefited from are still in effect. and any violation will result in significant financial penalties. David finally looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, a complete understanding of who he'd actually been married to and what he'd thrown away in pursuit of what he'd thought was something better. "Rachel," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I had no idea. If I'd known who you really were, you would have treated me completely differently," I finished for him. "You would have been respectful and loving and supportive. But David, don't you see? That's exactly the problem. You should have treated me well because I was your wife, not because I was rich." I gestured toward the bullet train, where the crew was patiently waiting for my return. "The woman you thought you were married to, the struggling logistics coordinator, who couldn't afford nice things or understand business strategy, that woman deserved love and respect too. She deserved a husband who valued her for who she was, not who he could use her to become." Tom began packing up the presentation equipment while Lisa gathered the scattered documents. Marcus handed David a thick envelope that contained the divorce papers and other legal documents that would formally end our marriage and protect my business interests. "You have 72 hours to vacate our apartment," I informed him. "Your personal belongings will be packed and moved to a storage facility." The rental agreement was in my name, paid for through one of my subsidiary companies. David opened the envelope with trembling hands, scanning the legal documents that laid out the terms of our divorce. His face grew paler as he read the financial details, particularly the section that explained how the prenuptial agreement he'd insisted upon would protect my assets from any claims he might make. "The prenup," he whispered. "You made me sign a prenup to protect yourself from me." "Actually," Marcus corrected, "you insisted on the prenup because you wanted to protect your assets from Rachel. You were so convinced that she was the one with something to gain from the marriage that you never considered the possibility that you were the one who was marrying up." I looked at David one last time, trying to find some trace of the man I'd fallen in love with 6 years ago. But that man had probably never really existed. The charming, supportive boyfriend had been a performance, just like my struggling coordinator persona. The difference was that I'd been protecting myself, while he'd been manipulating me. "Goodbye, David," I said, turning toward the train. "I hope Vanessa is everything you thought she was." I walked back to the bullet train without looking back, though I could hear David calling my name behind me. By the time I'd taken my seat in the luxurious cabin, Tom and Lisa and Marcus had joined me, and the train was already beginning to move. Through the window, I watched David standing alone on the platform, holding the envelope that contained the ruins of his carefully constructed life. His phone was ringing again, probably Vanessa calling to demand the money he didn't have to solve the crisis she'd created. As Union Station disappeared behind us, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd accomplished. The scared, heartbroken woman who'd been abandoned on that platform was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood the true value of patience, planning, and the perfect moment to reveal the truth. The train accelerated smoothly toward downtown, Portland, carrying me back to the life I'd built in secret and could finally live openly. David thought he'd traded up for a sophisticated woman who matched his ambitions. Instead, he'd traded away an empire for a mirage, and the woman he'd discarded was about to show the world exactly what he'd lost. The first domino fell exactly 18 hours after I'd left David standing on the platform at Union Station. Lisa called me at 7 in the morning as I was enjoying coffee on the terrace of my penthouse, watching the sunrise paint the Portland skyline in shades of gold and amber that perfectly matched my mood. "Paul Rodriguez just fired David," she reported, her voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and genuine sympathy. Apparently, David tried to salvage the Harrison Tech situation by claiming he had inside connections that could restore their relationship with Adams Logistics. When Paul called Tom to verify, Tom told him the truth about why we'd terminated our contracts. I set down my coffee cup, imagining the conversation that must have taken place in Paul's office. David, desperate and grasping at straws, probably spun some elaborate story about how his wife's mysterious transformation was just a misunderstanding that could be resolved with the right approach. Paul, being a practical businessman, would have called Tom immediately to explore any possibility of restoring the lucrative relationship that had been keeping his company profitable. How did Tom handle it? I asked, though I was confident. He'd managed the situation with his usual diplomatic precision. Perfectly. He explained that Adams Logistics maintains strict policies about personal and professional relationships, and that any attempt to leverage personal connections for business advantage would be viewed as a serious ethical violation. Paul understood immediately. The beauty of Tom's response was that it was entirely truthful while avoiding the more dramatic details of my marriage's collapse. Paul would draw his own conclusions about David's integrity and judgment, particularly given the timing of his personal crisis and the company's sudden loss of its most important client. "What about Vanessa's situation?" I inquired, settling back into my chair to enjoy the latest developments in what was becoming a truly spectacular chain reaction. Even better than we anticipated. She's been calling David nonstop since yesterday afternoon, but her problems have multiplied beyond just the hotel bill in Seattle. Meridian Marketing terminated her employment effective immediately, citing budget constraints and restructuring. She's now unemployed, stranded in an expensive hotel she can't afford, with maxed-out credit cards and no immediate prospects for income. I allowed myself a small smile as I pictured Vanessa's growing panic. The sophisticated, financially independent woman who'd seemed like such an upgrade from David's supposedly struggling wife was discovering that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling faster than she could patch the cracks. "There's more," Lisa continued. "Our investigators tracked some interesting communications from her hotel room. She's been reaching out to other men in her network, apparently looking for someone to help her out of her current predicament. The same strategy she used with David, essentially." The revelation wasn't particularly surprising, but it added another layer to the picture of Vanessa as someone who viewed relationships primarily as financial opportunities. David had probably felt special, thinking he was the successful executive who'd won over an impressive woman. In reality, he'd just been the most promising mark in her current rotation of potential benefactors. "Has David figured any of this out yet?" I asked. "That's where it gets interesting." David drove to Seattle yesterday evening, presumably to rescue Vanessa from her hotel situation. But when he arrived, she was in the bar with another man, someone she introduced as an old friend who was helping her through a temporary cash flow problem. I laughed, imagining David's face when he realized that his new relationship was based on exactly the same deceptions he'd accused me of practicing. The difference, of course, was that my deception had been designed to protect myself from people who might use me for my money, while Vanessa's was designed to find people she could use for theirs. "Our surveillance team got some excellent footage of that encounter," Lisa added. David looked like he was going to be sick when he realized what was happening. The other man turned out to be a Seattle businessman who's been married for 15 years and was clearly just looking for a discreet evening with someone he thought was an available woman. The beautiful irony was that Vanessa's desperation had led her to make exactly the same mistake David had made when he'd left me for her. She'd abandoned one relationship for what she thought was a better opportunity, only to discover that her new situation was built on lies and wishful thinking. By 9 o'clock, Tom had arrived at my penthouse with a comprehensive update on the cascading effects of our revelation. He spread several folders across my dining table, each one documenting a different aspect of the destruction that was spreading through David and Vanessa's lives like wildfire. "Harrison Tech's situation is worse than we anticipated," Tom began, opening the first folder. "Losing the Adams Logistics contracts was bad enough, but Paul's investigation into David's claims has revealed some other irregularities in his work." The folder contained copies of David's expense reports from the past year, highlighted to show a pattern of inflated claims and questionable charges. restaurant bills that were too expensive for the clients he claimed to be entertaining. Travel expenses for trips that seemed designed more for personal pleasure than business necessity. Hotel rooms in cities where Harrison Tech had no active projects. Paul started auditing David's work after our conversation yesterday, Tom explained. What he found suggests that David has been using company resources to subsidize his lifestyle, particularly his relationship with Vanessa. I examined the expense reports more closely, recognizing charges from restaurants where David had taken Vanessa on what he'd told me were client meetings. Hotel bills from weekends when he'd claimed to be attending business conferences, but had actually been having romantic getaways. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Paul is considering whether to pursue criminal charges for embezzlement, Tom continued. The amounts aren't enormous, but the pattern of deception is significant enough to damage David's reputation permanently. The second folder contained updates on Vanessa's deteriorating situation. She'd been evicted from the Seattle hotel after her credit cards were finally declined for the accumulated charges. The married businessman she'd been courting had disappeared as soon as he realized her financial problems were real and immediate. She'd been forced to take a bus back to Portland, unable to afford even a basic airline ticket. Her apartment has been foreclosed on, Tom noted, pointing to a legal document in the folder. The bank initiated proceedings 3 weeks ago, but she was apparently hoping to resolve her financial problems before the situation became critical. Where is she staying now? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. With David, in what used to be your apartment. Though that arrangement may not last long, since you've given him 72 hours to vacate. The third folder was the most interesting, containing reports from investigators who'd been tracking the wider implications of David and Vanessa's professional and personal downfall. The story was beginning to spread through Portland's business community, creating a cautionary tale about deception, betrayal, and the consequences of underestimating the people closest to you. 3 other companies have canceled contracts with Harrison Tech, Tom reported. They're citing concerns about the company's stability and leadership, but the real issue is that they don't want to be associated with the scandal. What kind of scandal? I asked, though I was pleased to hear that our story was generating the kind of buzz that would make David's professional rehabilitation nearly impossible. It's being described as the most expensive divorce mistake in Portland history. The details are still unclear to most people, but the basic story has spread through executive circles. Successful businessman leaves wife for mistress, only to discover that wife was actually a multimillionaire who'd been supporting his career behind the scenes. The fourth folder contained financial projections for David's future prospects, and the numbers were grimmer than I'd expected. Without my connections and support, his value in the consulting market was minimal. His reputation was damaged by the circumstances of his termination from Harrison Tech. His personal finances were strained by credit card debt he'd accumulated trying to impress Vanessa. He's looking at bankruptcy within 6 months, Tom concluded. Even if he finds new employment immediately, his debt load and living expenses exceed any realistic income he might earn. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city where David was presumably dealing with the complete collapse of everything he'd thought he was building. The vindication I felt was intense, but not entirely satisfying. I'd wanted him to understand what he'd lost, but seeing the extent of his destruction was more sobering than celebratory. There's something else, Tom said quietly. David has been trying to contact you. Phone calls, emails, even showing up at the Adams Logistics building yesterday afternoon. Security turned him away, but he left a letter. He handed me an envelope, with my name written in David's familiar handwriting. The paper was expensive, probably taken from the hotel where he and Vanessa had been staying, but the writing was shaky and desperate. I opened the letter and read David's attempt to explain himself, to apologize, to somehow negotiate a resolution that might salvage something from the wreckage of his life. The words were carefully chosen but desperate, acknowledging his mistakes. while trying to suggest that my deception had been equally problematic. "He's asking for a meeting," I said, folding the letter and setting it aside. "He wants to discuss what he calls a mutually beneficial resolution to our situation." "What kind of resolution could be mutually beneficial at this point?" Tom asked. "He's probably hoping I'll agree to provide some kind of financial support in exchange for his discretion about our marriage and my business practices. A strategic divorce settlement that allows both of us to save face publicly." The proposal was actually more reasonable than I'd expected from David, and it suggested that he was finally beginning to understand the true scope of the power imbalance in our relationship. But it also revealed that he still didn't comprehend the fundamental issue that had destroyed our marriage. Lisa knocked on the door and entered with her tablet, clearly excited about whatever information she'd just received. "You need to see this," she said, setting the device on the table and pulling up a news website. The headline read, "Local Tech Executive Terminated Following Investigation into Financial Irregularities." The article was brief but damaging, describing David's termination from Harrison Tech and the ongoing investigation into his expense reports and business practices. Paul Rodriguez was quoted as saying that the company maintained the highest standards of integrity and would cooperate fully with any additional investigations. "It gets better," Lisa said, scrolling down to the comments section. "Someone who clearly knows the inside story has been posting details about the real reason for David's termination." The comments painted a picture of a man who'd been living beyond his means while taking credit for successes that weren't entirely his own. References to his wife's mysterious wealth and his affair with a financially desperate colleague were scattered throughout the discussion, creating a narrative that was both accurate and devastating. "Do we know who's posting these comments?" I asked. "Marcus thinks it might be someone from Harrison Tech who was close enough to the situation to know the details, but distant enough to feel comfortable sharing them anonymously," Tom replied. "Paul probably briefed his senior staff about the situation, and word is spreading from there." By noon, the story had taken on a life of its own. David's professional network was buzzing with speculation about the circumstances of his termination and the mysterious wealth of his estranged wife. Vanessa's situation was being discussed as a cautionary tale about the dangers of financial deception in relationships. The fifth folder contained the most unexpected development of all. Several companies had reached out to Adams Logistics expressing interest in hiring David's replacement, but their inquiries had revealed something interesting about Harrison Tech's client relationships. "It turns out that David's clients weren't particularly loyal to him personally," Tom explained. "Most of them are happy to work with other consultants, and several have expressed interest in working directly with Adams Logistics instead of through intermediary firms. We're looking at a potential revenue increase of about $12 million annually if we decide to bring those consulting services in-house," Lisa added. "David's termination might actually improve our business position significantly." The irony was perfect. David's betrayal and subsequent downfall had inadvertently created new opportunities for the company he'd never known his wife owned. His clients, freed from their relationships with Harrison Tech, were now available to work directly with the business empire he'd never even suspected existed. I spent the afternoon reviewing proposals from department heads who wanted to expand Adams Logistics into consulting services, taking advantage of the market opportunity that David's professional destruction had created. The preliminary numbers suggested that we could easily absorb his former clients while providing them with better service and more competitive pricing. As evening approached, I found myself standing on my terrace again, watching the lights of Portland twinkle to life below. Somewhere in the city, David was probably dealing with the latest round of consequences from his choices. His career was destroyed, his reputation was ruined, his relationship with Vanessa was collapsing, and his financial future looked increasingly bleak. The revenge I'd planned had exceeded my expectations, but the satisfaction I felt was complicated by an unexpected emotion that took me a moment to identify. It wasn't regret exactly, but it was a recognition that the man I'd married and the Man I'd destroyed weren't entirely the same person. The David I'd fallen in love with 6 years ago had possessed qualities that were genuine kindness, intelligence, ambition, humor. Those qualities had been corrupted by success and entitlement. But they'd existed once. The man I'd left standing on the platform at Union Station was someone who'd been revealed as shallow and selfish, but he was also someone who was learning painful truths about himself and the world. Tom joined me on the terrace as the sun set, behind the mountains. "Any second thoughts about how far we've taken this?" he asked quietly. I considered the question carefully. David had betrayed our marriage and treated me with contempt and cruelty. He'd built his success on my hidden support while mocking my supposed failures. He'd thrown away 6 years of marriage for a woman who turned out to be exactly as deceptive as he was. But the consequences he was facing would follow him for years, possibly for the rest of his life. His career in Portland was finished. His reputation was permanently damaged. His financial situation was desperate. The woman he'd chosen over me had already moved on to other opportunities. "No," I said finally. "He made his choices, and now he's learning what those choices cost. The only thing I regret is that it took me 6 years to stop protecting him from the consequences of his own character." My phone buzzed with another message from David, the 4th one that day. Like the others, it went unread and unanswered. Whatever he wanted to say to me now was 6 years too late and several $1,000,000 too small. The empire I'd built in secret was finally mine to run openly. The man who'd made me feel small and worthless was discovering just how large and valuable I actually was. And tomorrow, I would begin the process of expanding Adams Logistics into new markets and new opportunities, including some that had been created by the very betrayal that had originally broken my heart. 3 months had passed since that transformative afternoon at Union Station, and the Portland business landscape bore little resemblance to what it had been before my revelation. I stood in the executive conference room of the newly expanded Adams Logistics headquarters, looking out at a view that now included the Harrison Tech building, which we'd acquired the previous week at a fraction of its former value. The morning's newspaper lay open on my desk, featuring a business section article titled, "Adams Logistics Completes Transformation of Regional Transportation Sector." The piece described our company's aggressive expansion into consulting services, our acquisition of struggling competitors, and our emergence as the dominant force in Pacific Northwest logistics. What it didn't mention was that the foundation for this growth had been laid by my ex-husband's spectacular professional collapse. Lisa entered the conference room with her usual efficiency, carrying a tablet loaded with the quarterly reports that would be presented to our board of directors that afternoon. "The final numbers are even better than we projected," she announced, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Revenue is up 47% from last quarter, profit margins have increased by 12 points, and we've gained market share in every sector we target." I reviewed the financial summaries, noting how many of our new clients were companies that had previously worked with David or with firms that had been damaged by the scandal surrounding his termination. The business community's reaction to his downfall had been swift and decisive. Companies wanted to distance themselves from any association with financial impropriety or questionable business practices, and they'd been eager to establish relationships with Adams Logistics as a way of demonstrating their commitment to integrity and professionalism. "What's the latest on our former competitors?" I asked, though I was fairly certain I knew the answer. "Harrison Tech closed permanently last week. Paul Rodriguez filed for bankruptcy after losing their remaining clients and being unable to secure additional financing. Meridian Marketing is down to 3 employees and is expected to fold within the month. Patterson Consulting has been acquired by a Seattle firm, but they've basically discontinued all Portland operations." The cascade of business failures that had followed David's revelation continued to ripple through the local economy. Companies that had been tangentially connected to the scandal found themselves struggling to maintain credibility with clients who were increasingly concerned about due diligence and background checks. The phrase "pulling a Morrison" had entered local business vernacular as a way of describing someone who had catastrophically misjudged a situation due to their own arrogance. "And David's current situation?" I inquired, though I was no longer checking on him out of concern for his welfare. Lisa consulted her tablet, pulling up a file that our security team maintained for potential threats to company operations. "He's working at a call center in Gresham, selling extended warranties for household appliances. The job pays about a third of what he was making at Harrison Tech, and he's struggling to keep up with his debt payments." The image of David in a cubicle, reading scripts to uninterested customers who hung up on him throughout the day, was both pathetic and poetic. The man who had once mocked my supposed lack of professional achievement was now employed in exactly the kind of job he'd always considered beneath his attention. "Vanessa moved to Sacramento 2 months ago," Lisa continued. "She's working as a receptionist for a dental practice and living in a studio apartment. Our investigators lost track of her after she stopped using social media and changed her phone number." I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy for Vanessa, though it was tempered by the memory of her role in destroying my marriage. She'd been an opportunist who'd made the same mistake David had made, mistaking surface appearances for underlying reality. Her punishment was perhaps more severe than her crime deserved, but it was also the natural consequence of building a lifestyle on borrowed money and borrowed time. Tom knocked on the conference room door and entered with Marcus Thompson, both of them carrying briefcases that I knew contained the final documentation for the most significant development in our company's expansion strategy. "The Seattle acquisition is finalized," Tom announced, setting his briefcase on the table. "Northwest Rail Holdings is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Adams Logistics, giving us direct control over passenger and freight rail service throughout Washington and Northern Oregon." The acquisition had been 18 months in the making, but David's downfall had accelerated the timeline significantly. Northwest Rail's board of directors had been impressed by our handling of what they termed a sensitive personnel matter, and they'd viewed our discretion and professionalism as evidence that we were the kind of partners they wanted for their company's future. Marcus opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of contracts and corporate documents. "This gives Adams Logistics unprecedented control over transportation infrastructure in the region," he explained. "We now own or control trucking fleets, shipping facilities, railroad lines, and logistics coordination services from Vancouver to San Francisco." I signed the final papers, officially completing the largest acquisition in our company's history. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's betrayal had ultimately led to my company becoming exactly the kind of transportation empire he'd dreamed of working for. If he'd remained loyal to our marriage, he might have been positioned to benefit from this expansion. Instead, he was selling extended warranties to people who didn't want them. "There's something else," Tom said, his tone suggesting that whatever he was about to share was significant. "We've received an interesting communication from the Portland Business Journal. They want to interview you for a cover story about women in leadership and the transformation of traditional male-dominated industries." The interview request was a validation I hadn't realized I was seeking. For years, I'd operated in the shadows, allowing others to take credit for my achievements while I focused on building something substantial and lasting. The idea of stepping fully into the spotlight, of being recognized publicly for what I'd accomplished, was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. "What's the angle they're pursuing?" I asked. "They want to focus on your emergence as a major business leader and how you've transformed the transportation sector in just a few months. They're particularly interested in the story of how you maintained your anonymity while building the company, though they don't seem to know the details about your marriage." I considered the implications of such an interview. It would cement my position as a legitimate business leader and provide a platform for sharing my vision for the company's future. It would also ensure that David's story remained in the public consciousness, serving as a permanent reminder of the consequences of his choices. Schedule it for next week, I decided. But make sure they understand that I won't be discussing personal matters or individual personnel decisions. Lisa made a note on her tablet. Should we prepare talking points about the company's growth strategy and acquisition plans? Yes, and also about our commitment to creating opportunities for women and minorities in transportation and logistics. I want to use this platform to announce our new scholarship program and our partnerships with universities to develop the next generation of industry leaders. The scholarship program had been my personal project for the past month, a way of ensuring that other women wouldn't have to build their careers in secrecy the way I had. We would be funding full tuition for 30 students per year, with a focus on supporting people who might not otherwise have access to the education and opportunities they needed to succeed. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself thinking about the strange journey that had led me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been playing the role of a struggling logistics coordinator, hiding my success to protect myself from people who might use me for my wealth. Today, I was the CEO of the largest transportation company in the region, preparing to be featured on the cover of a major business magazine. The transformation hadn't been without costs. My marriage was over, though I'd come to understand that it had been based on deceptions from both sides. My trust in people had been damaged, though working with Tom and Lisa and Marcus had helped me remember that not everyone was motivated by greed or opportunism. My sense of privacy had been compromised, though I was learning to appreciate the freedom that came with living openly as the person I'd always been. At 4 o'clock, I received an unexpected visitor. Security called to inform me that Jennifer Walsh, a reporter from a local television station, was in the lobby asking for an impromptu interview about my company's impact on the regional economy. She says she's working on a follow-up story about business developments that have emerged from what she's calling the Morrison scandal, the security guard explained. She's specifically interested in talking to you about how Adams Logistics has positioned itself as a leader in corporate responsibility. I was tempted to decline the interview, but something about the reporter's approach intrigued me. The Morrison scandal, as it was apparently now being called, had become a case study in business ethics and personal responsibility. If Jennifer Walsh was framing the story around positive developments that had emerged from the situation, it might be an opportunity to demonstrate how crisis could lead to positive change. Send her up, I told security. But make sure she understands that this will be a brief conversation and that I won't be discussing personal matters. Jennifer Walsh turned out to be a sharp, professional woman in her early 30s who clearly understood the significance of the story she was covering. She arrived with a small camera crew and a list of questions that demonstrated she'd done her research about Adams Logistics and its recent expansion. "Ms. Adams," she began after we'd settled in my office, "6 months ago, very few people in Portland knew your name. Today, you're being described as one of the most influential business leaders in the region. Can you talk about how this transformation happened so quickly?" I chose my words carefully, focusing on the business strategy and market opportunities that had driven our growth. Adams Logistics has been building our capabilities and market position for years. What you're seeing now is the result of careful planning and strategic investments that are finally coming to fruition. We identified opportunities in the market and moved quickly to capitalize on them. Some people have suggested that your company's growth has been accelerated by the collapse of competing firms, particularly Harrison Tech and several other local businesses. Do you view their failures as beneficial to your success? The question was more direct than I'd expected, but it was also fair. Market consolidation is a natural part of business evolution, I replied. Companies that maintain high standards of integrity and performance tend to succeed, while those that don't tend to struggle. We focus on providing exceptional service to our clients and maintaining the highest ethical standards in all our operations. There have been rumors about your connection to David Morrison, the former Harrison Tech executive, whose termination sparked much of the recent industry turbulence. Can you comment on those rumors? I'd been expecting this question, and I'd prepared an answer that was truthful without being revealing. I don't discuss personal matters in business contexts, and I don't comment on the employment situations of individuals at other companies. Adams Logistics evaluates all our business relationships based on professional criteria, and we maintain strict boundaries between personal and professional considerations. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, covering topics like our expansion plans, our commitment to community development, and our vision for the future of transportation services in the Pacific Northwest. Jennifer Walsh's questions were intelligent and well-informed, and I found myself enjoying the opportunity to articulate publicly the goals and values that had been driving my work for years. After the camera crew packed up their equipment and left, I stood at my office window watching the city bustling below. The Portland skyline was changing rapidly, with new construction projects and business developments creating a landscape that reflected the region's economic growth. Adams Logistics had played a significant role in that growth, and our continued expansion would shape the area's development for years to come. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief but unmistakable. In its origin, "Saw you on the news. Congratulations on your success. I hope you're happy. David." I stared at the message for a long moment, surprised by the mixture of emotions it evoked. There was satisfaction in knowing that David had seen my television interview and understood the magnitude of what he'd lost. There was also a trace of sadness for the man he'd been before ambition and entitlement had corrupted his character. But mostly, there was a sense of closure. David's message represented the final chapter of our relationship, an acknowledgement that he understood the game was over and that he'd lost completely. He wasn't asking for forgiveness or offering apologies or suggesting that we might find some way to reconcile. He was simply recognizing that I had moved on to a life that didn't include him, and that his absence from that life was permanent. I deleted the message without responding and turned my attention to the evening's agenda. There was a dinner meeting with potential investors from Tokyo, a conference call with our Seattle operations team, and a review of proposals for our expansion into California markets. Over the following weeks, the momentum of change continued to accelerate. The Portland Business Journal cover story generated national attention, leading to interview requests from business publications across the country. Harvard Business School invited me to speak at a conference on entrepreneurship and innovation. The Transportation Industry Association asked me to join their board of directors. Each opportunity reinforced my emergence as a legitimate business leader and helped establish Adams Logistics as a model for how companies could grow rapidly while maintaining ethical standards. The contrast with David's approach to business was stark and intentional. Where he had relied on deception and corner-cutting, we emphasized transparency and integrity. Where he had taken credit for others' work, we celebrated collaborative achievement and shared success. The most satisfying development came when Northwestern University offered me an honorary doctorate in recognition of my contributions to the transportation industry and my advocacy for women in business. The ceremony would take place in 6 months, providing a symbolic culmination to my transformation from hidden CEO to public leader. As autumn turned to winter, I found myself reflecting on how completely my life had changed since that rainy night at Union Station. The woman who had been abandoned on the platform had been someone who hid her true self to avoid being used by others. The woman who emerged from that experience was someone who used her authentic self to create value for her company, her employees, and her community. David's betrayal had been the catalyst for this transformation, but it hadn't been the cause. The cause had been my own decision to stop living in fear of being discovered and to start embracing the power and responsibility that came with success. The empire I'd built in secret had always been impressive, but the empire I was building in public would be legendary. The final vindication came on a December morning when Forbes magazine called to inform me that I'd been selected for their annual list of the most powerful women in business. The recognition was based on Adams Logistics' financial performance, our market impact, and my leadership in transforming industry practices around diversity and inclusion. I accepted the honor with the same grace and professionalism that had characterized my approach to every challenge since leaving David standing on that train platform. The scared, hidden woman was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true power came not from being mysterious or untouchable, but from being authentic, capable, and unafraid. David Morrison had thought he was trading up when he left me for Vanessa Moore. Instead, he'd traded away an empire for an illusion, and the woman he'd discarded had used his betrayal as the foundation for building something even greater than what she'd lost. The bullet train that had carried me back to confront him that day had been more than just a dramatic gesture. It had been a symbol of the journey from hiding to revelation, from victim to victor, from secret CEO to public leader. And as I looked ahead to the future I was building, I knew that the best revenge wasn't just success, it was using that success to create opportunities for others and to build something that would last long after the people who had underestimated me were forgotten. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.